Welcome back, everyone, to session five, which is really just a continuation of session four. We're going to try and pick up right where we left off. Obviously, this is an incredibly vast topic. We could spend many episodes on it, but didn't want to leave anything out there too long after the last session. So you and I were just kind of clarifying. And if you don't mind, what were you sharing?
Well, we were talking, you had talked that perhaps you can share some of the resistance that comes
Mm-hmm.
up when you're trying to practice his presence or being in the now, and
Mm-hmm.
that the resistance is actually, quote, the work or
Mm-hmm.
what you need to explore because
Right.
it's preventing you from being in that state all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of gave you a thought about you had had intellectual agreement with a lot of the promises of God, but you weren't living them out. And it's
Yeah.
that resistant or that limit or those old ideas and opinions and ego self that actually prevents you from being in practicing it or
Totally.
putting it into practice, if you will.
Right. Well,
And
and you had said it reminded you of something specifically that Dr. Jim had shared, and
oh,
that's what I
right.
was.
Well, we've been talking about righteousness and how the Lord has promised or given us righteousness. This new spirit that we host, of the new spirit that's talked about in Ezekiel that we read not too long, or you just read,
Hmm.
that I've given you a new heart and a new spirit, and that new spirit is 100% righteous.
Hmm.
And a lot of the definition of righteous is as it is or as it should be.
Hmm.
And I love the definition boiled down to harmony and alignment
Hmm.
uh, with Him and creation and everything and how He created this world to be. So
Hmm.
when we've been given this spirit that is completely in harmony with how it is, how
Hmm.
it should be, and um, that resistance that we're talking about, those limits, those other ideas that take us out of that harmony, is
Hmm.
really what we try to eliminate in our
Yeah,
walk. Yeah.
exactly. And again, I think that um, we we label it as sort of internal conflict, which I think is another way of saying that this harmony has been put within us, and we experience a departure from that. And in actuality, this is kind of the concept that I wanted to maybe dive into a little more. In actuality, it is an illusion of disharmony, because what he created cannot be warped, twisted. What and in fact, I know we've joked about it uh, offline in our own conversations about, when God says legal and illegal, that in our sort of Western construct of society, even laws are subject to approval. Like, okay, yeah, it's illegal to speed, but like, I might speed. Yeah, it's illegal to do some of these drugs, but look around. Everybody's doing them. And so the concept of legal and illegal being something that we get to make a value judgment on whether or not we'll do it and or why, from a kingdom perspective, there's no concept of illegal. There is no contemplation of those who dwell in the light that darkness could in any way infringe upon it. And so when I think about my own internal conflict, my own disharmony, and how on the one layer, intellectual agreement with his truth, with his promises, with the law, if you will, the logos of God, intellectual agreement of that is better than not agreeing with it,
Yeah,
you know?
a
And
step.
so it's a step, exactly. It's part of the ironic journey through time linearly. And yet, what I have come to see and why I kind of wanted to maybe dive into some of that resistance is not to talk about, well, here's what I've experienced and this is my walk, as much as it is not something that is an overnight fix. It is not the departure from the way that I've thought for 30 years is just because it's a lie doesn't mean that I can overcome it, and especially not with logic. And I think that's what I wanted to focus on is myself, not necessarily we, but I think even still we really try to use logic to come over to the light. We try and say, and again, we've mentioned it before, your friend who was like, I know I should turn the other cheek, but, and that to me is using logic to stand in his truth rather than the fundamental harmony internally with the fact that the nature of his spirit is to turn the other cheek. The nature of his spirit is to be gracious, merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. That it's his nature to be forgiving. And that actually the resistance we experience is we think there's a delta between, okay, I know I should be forgiving, but I'm really mad at that person right now. And we think this right here is the gap that we need to cross over. And what I'm trying to say is that this gap doesn't exist. This is the gap that our ego creates that says, not you, not yet. So you think you're here and you need to work your way to forgiveness in the future where you forgive them. And although there might be actual truth on earth of you experiencing forgiving them over the course of time, you have to constantly bring attention and awareness to your unforgiveness. The truth is, you are now the spirit that he's put in you.
So your forgiveness incarnate.
Yes, you are, your nature is forgiveness. And actually, the disharmony you feel, which we might label as guilt, which we might label as shame, we might label it as any number of negative emotions that you're experiencing while you're not yet forgiving them. You think that you're here and you need to move to forgiveness. And that is the rub. The resistance is that your nature is now the one who forgives. And your attachment to the one who hasn't yet forgiven but needs to is what creates the perceived gap between you and standing in that promise. And that is very complex teaching to the ego, and why intellectual acceptance of it just isn't enough to dwell in that truth.
Well, I was going to say that difference between that you were talking about also is it's what we think it's going to serve us in some way. So that's why we do it. And that's why we hold on to it. So back to your point about holding on to that old self and the attachment to it. Well, because it served us for a really long time. If I can hold you in emotional debt and not forgive you, then you behave differently towards me.
Yep.
Exactly. And so that's kind of why we do it. And so it once we can become the observer of those actions we do that are unrighteous, then we can stand in more righteousness. And so that's what he's talking about, is the unrighteous man. I mean, we think like religion makes us think that we have to go clean ourselves up.
It's a behavior standard.
A behavior standard. But if we as Jesus taught, love righteousness and hate unrighteousness. When we
Mm-hmm.
start to make a commitment now, then we'll start to feel that disharmony, and we'll start to make choices that, oh, I can forgive
Mm-hmm.
right now and
Exactly. Well,
be
and
back
it's
in
funny.
harmony.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go
It's
ahead.
funny. I think it was in the last session where we talked about, um, oh gosh, you had just said something that reminded me of it. Um, I
Attachment to the old serving
it's
self.
no, it's serving you exactly. And we said in the last one that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. And this, I think, is almost the entire premise of the ego, which just for clarity's sake, the ego is the separate mind from the totality of consciousness that is God. When we hear him say he is in all and through all and with all, that is, he is the totality of all of creation. And that's why it's actually an illusion that there's anything separate from him. But our departure from the garden is where we gave birth to a belief in our separation from him. And now that's been embedded in our psyche for eons. And so we not only believe it's true, we actually think that's us, and that this other self is something that we need to come into. But when you talk about serving you, you, for the rest of your life, will endlessly be able to justify your negative emotions towards anyone and everything in all of creation. For all of your earthly days, you have proof. You have a reason, you have justification, you have emotional reasoning why you shouldn't forgive them. You should be angry at them. They deserve to be punished. And this is, in my opinion, one of the most neglected teachings of Jesus, which sort of came from Jesus, but sort of comes from Paul, who helps equip us with the word. It's got to be Hebrews because he's referring to Abel, but maybe it's in Romans. But he talks about the blood of Abel crying out and the blood of Jesus crying out a better word. And what we learn from the book of Enoch is that the blood of Abel is crying out for justice. His brother has slain him, and it's wrong. And that is wrong. We will never reach a point where Cain was justified, and so Abel doesn't have a claim for justice. And this is the whole point of that teaching. Jesus didn't come to fix up that. He came so that his blood would cry out a better word and teach us the new, better word, which is now the spirit that we are, which Jesus came and said the opposite of Abel. Abel was in the right and was still slain and says, give me justice. I'm the victim. And Jesus came, the perfect lamb, and said, let sin come into me. Let all the wickedness, all the evil come into me, and I will take responsibility for it. When you talk about the nature of a father, that to me is the nature of a loving father, saying, I know that all my children, all of humanity has behaved really, really poorly. And instead of punishing them the way they deserve from the cosmic scales of justice, it would be in balance to justify them being served and them being punished for that. I will take this punishment once and for all. And so his blood cries out, not that I'm the victim. It's the opposite. It's the empowerment of, you don't take my life, I lay it down. And so I know that's kind of feels like a tangent, but it comes back to, for me, the idea of serving self. And the only reason that we hold on to any negative emotion, period, is because we think it serves us. And when you do identify with the ego mind, when you identify as the victim, as the one who's been wronged, as the one who needs to be served, you will forever be able to find reasons why you should keep this negative emotion. And again, just to be clear, I'm not saying that part of the human experience isn't sadness, isn't betrayal, isn't pain, isn't anger.
Anger, yeah.
All of those things are natural experiences of human life. Why? Because we're in a fallen world. Because we're not yet on that side of the kingdom where sorrow and sighing flee away. And so the whole point of his teaching is not that these things don't happen to you. That's the parable of the house built on rock. Both houses get rained on, but the one built on sand falls over, and the one built on rock, the winds blew and the rain fell, but that house stood strong. That's what he's given us. Not that these emotions won't come, not that negativity won't be experienced. It's that your foundation is so rock solid that you would come back to that house 2 days later and you couldn't even tell it rained. That is the whole premise of what he's teaching us. And so what we're talking about, the resistance, really what I wanted to focus on is the fact that you can hold on to that for the rest of your days if you want to. But to recognize that the only part of you that wants to hold on to it is the part of you that is already identifying with and as separate, suffering, not one with him. And what he's given to you, if you'll have it, is that for all time, through his son, that has been solved. You have peace with him forever. You are now returned to one with him. I am in the Father, and you are in me, and I'm in him, and I'm in you. That endless sort of swirl is really just I think, a way of conceptualizing you have been returned to harmony. You have been returned to righteousness, and that's the spirit I've put in you. And it's only your ego, your separate self, that listening to this right now, you say, well, that's just not true of me. Well, as long as you continue to believe that and hold on to that negativity which serves you, because in my own life, it served me as being an excuse where I was able to point and say, that's just simply not true. I'm not experiencing that. That's not the case. The whole point of me holding on to that was I have someone to blame for not experiencing it now. And my wind up, if you will, you could say everyone's with blame, is I believed that the one to be blamed does not deserve love. And so in this sort of background, I didn't even recognize this process going on. I had believed that if I was to blame for the fact that I'm not standing in the promises, then I don't deserve to be loved, period. And it's like, that's a whole nother layer of Jesus' teaching is none of you deserve it. That's the point.
That's why I gave it for free.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All of you are to blame. And even in being to blame, recognize that God loves you so much more. Your heart may condemn you, and yet he's so much bigger than that, because it doesn't matter who's to blame, I still love you. And in fact, blame is just a shifting of personal responsibility. You only feel like someone else is to blame when you can't bear the weight of having to deal with your problems for yourself and take them to the Father to be sorted out. When you have a massive amount of pain, frustration, anger, justification, victimhood, when you've got tons of problems in your life, when you are in a wheelchair, have asthma, whatever it is, you got this laundry list of things that are proof to you that his promises aren't true. And actually, subconsciously, you hold on to and fight for those bounds, because if those are your fault, then you got to be the one to deal with it. And that, again, is a whole another layer of teaching, as far as it's not on you to fix, but it is on you to shift, but it's not on you, but it is on you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I love it. When
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned responsibility, it was pointed out to me, it is actually the word ability and response.
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
you are working on your ability to respond differently. And people automatically think blame is not, there's no blame anywhere in there. Now of
Mm-hmm.
course that is our human experience, and
Right.
and even from the garden, right? What did he do at the very first? What was that woman that you put with me that
Totally. Well, I mean, look at the news cycle today.
oh
It's
yeah,
this guy's fault. Global
yeah,
warming is your guy's fault. It's this, this, this. It's always about pointing the finger, because if someone is to blame, then the problem is half solved. And that's
yeah,
just not the way the kingdom works.
yeah. But working on self-responsibility or your
Mm-hmm.
ability to respond. And like what you talked about with, there will be rain. The rains will come, and
Mm-hmm.
but it's what your house is built on, and building on the rock. He is going to request and work with you and be your teacher to help you in your ability to respond to those things that come up in your life. And maybe you can share, you were kind of an aggressive driver, and that's where some of your frustration would be shown. But the other day you said you kind of were
Yeah, it's funny. I
practicing.
mean, again, it's, I'll say by no means is this solved. I still, and again, not even to make light of it, but I do chuckle to myself that I get really frustrated um, with other drivers, and I think that that's kind of the human condition. You know,
Mhm.
when you're driving on the highway, let's say you're going 75, the guy in front of you going 65 is an idiot, and the guy who zooms by you going 85 is also an idiot. You are going the perfectly right speed. So I will caveat that, but I have been frustrated at at times it feels like people are unaware, and I think that that unawareness is actually a true statement about their unconsciousness, where they simply need to serve themselves, and that manifests in every aspect of their life. So when they're driving, they're not concerned with other drivers, they're concerned about serving themselves. And so I'm on a road that has 3 lanes, and I'm going to turn right, and here in the US we can turn right on red, and I'm the only car in my lane. There's 50 feet between me and the stoplight, and there's a car in the middle lane that's maybe 2 or 3 cars back, and he, just as I'm getting up there, cuts in front of me and cuts me off. I have to slam on the brakes a little bit, and he ends up pulling up to the stoplight, and he doesn't turn right. And so here's this 2 minutes where I have to sit at this light that I could have already turned at. And the lesson for me was, as I practice the now, my attachment to the way that I think it should go was, number one, because I'm only thinking about serving me when I'm in that place of separation. And number two, the reason I think it should go a certain way is because I believe that I have determined the best route from here to where I'm going. And I thought of this as, again, not to make it too deep, but almost an analogy for my life. And so recognizing in that moment, him cutting me off wasn't bad. It was just a thing. It just is. And it's only my attachment to, it should have gone another way. It should be like this. I should be doing this. My insistence upon that was the only source of my suffering. And so being able to put that off, as silly as it might sound, I was able to sit at that light for those 2 minutes. And now, again, it's 2 minutes. The heck are we talking about? But in
But
our
this is
life,
practice.
it
Yeah.
adds up. And that 2 minutes, not only was it coming back to neutral, the grounding, if you will, like we talked about, coming back to neutral to say, okay, I'm not attached. It is what it is. I'm here behind him, and that just is. the positive, the plus one is there are things that I cannot see or perceive. This entire tapestry of the world, all of creation, all of humanity commingling and interacting on some level, this is actually for my good. And now you could say it's for my good because it helped me depart from negative emotion, victimhood, justification. But maybe if I had made that right on red, there's a guy who wasn't looking at his phone and he zooms out in front of me 2 blocks down the road and I hit him. I T-bone him because he wasn't looking. We can play the what if game forever, but the whole point in saying it is that it's only our attachment to what we think it should be that causes us to suffer in this moment. And that is ultimately what we've been talking about for the last 2 sessions, I think, which is coming back to the now. The obstacle is the way because your resistance to whatever is presented, if it's your feelings, it's your thoughts, it's your emotions, it's whatever, your resistance and believing that it shouldn't be like that, it should be another way, is what makes you suffer, not the thought, emotion, occurrence, situation itself. And so the way to practice that, as we have found, it is so much easier to practice this state of mind when you don't need it. You practice this on a daily basis when things are generally good, so that when things do go wrong, you can tap into it, as opposed to you don't wait until things go wrong, as I did for kind of the first, I'll say 2 or 3 years. I was intellectually agreeing with all of these teachings, and then something would go wrong and all of it would go out the window. And it would go immediately back to, I'll say, the lowest version of myself as far as a prepared state. And that lowest version was still a victim, still attached to what I thought it should be. And again, we've said it before, we'll say it again in the future. The outer world is just a reflection of the inner world. And the way that you experience life is a mirror back to you. I'm not saying that the person you see on TV who committed a grotesque crime is actually the spirit that's within you. What I'm saying is, when you're driving and you get pissed off at someone's actions in front of you, that's actually mirroring back to you a fault, a frustration, an inner disharmony. And this life circumstance has just plucked that string so that you think it's because of them that you're responding this way, when, just like we talked about in the first session, when you squeeze an orange juice is going to come out 100% of the time. And so when life squeezes you and you think that it's because of life, because of that person, in reality, it's the resistance within you that you are not addressing, not taking personal responsibility for, to shift the way that you respond. That is what's causing not only the suffering internally, but perpetuates the cycle of suffering externally. And that's another reason that Jesus was so willing to go to the cross, is this endless cycle of hurt people, and he just let it stop with him. He wasn't hurt, but he let those who were hurt touch him, just so that that anger could finally come to a stop. And if you'll have it, he took all of that to the grave with him, and the new you doesn't host that at all. It's only your attachment and belief that somehow it still serves you that is keeping you attached and keeping that version of you alive.
So nail it to the cross, like you said. Just
Exactly.
pick up your cross daily, and that's what it is. It's dying
Mm-hmm.
to those pieces because he already did. That's good.
Exactly. Yeah, not bad. And again, I know that I can get on a tangent a little bit, so I appreciate you listening in and staying with me. We just have a few minutes left, but if there were any thoughts that you're kind of having if you were to sort of say what's been bubbling up from this session or from the last two sessions as we talk about it? Anything you'd want to share?
Well, I think John 15 is a beautiful description, the whole chapter. And he's like talking about abide in him. And
Mm,
this is what I think that the power of now and uh, standing in his righteousness and in our new spirit, I think that's what
mm-hmm,
it's all about. It's abide in him. And there was an old book, I think I mentioned it to you before. It's I think from the 70s, but I tapped into it in the beginning of my walk. But it's practicing his presence.
mm,
And you can, just like you, that example at the cars, in traffic,
mm-hmm,
we need to practice this because it is our default is not necessarily this.
mm-hmm,
So as we practice it at first, it's very deliberate, but
mm-hmm.
then it becomes effortless.
Totally.
But so worth it to live from abiding in him or from
Mm,
his presence or in the now.
totally. And again, I think it's funny is not the right word, like haha, but it really is funny how invested we are in this world of illusion and separation, to the point where we genuinely think that if he just zapped us right now, if I just zapped you and you were in paradise, if I just zapped you and you had $10 million in your bank account, that our investment in the world of separation tells us that once this thing is solved, then I'll be okay. And yet, Adam and Eve were in the garden. Literally, Eden means pleasure. There's no greater place to exist than this. And they got to the place on their own of saying, yeah, well, but. And so when I just flipped to John 15, you have already been cleansed by the word I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. And he's saying, I abide in you.
Mm-hmm.
Abide in me as I abide in you. And that to me is just like that Ezekiel verse. This new heart, this new spirit has been given. And now your investment in that as the fundamental truth, your deliberate practice in areas where it's not yet true to stand in this truth are what make it true in your experience, even though it's already true on a planar level. And so I love that, especially because he says, abide in me and bear fruit. You don't need to work to bear fruit. That is the function of a branch on a tree. It just bears the blossoms, it bears leaves, it
Mm-hmm.
bears fruit. We think and focus so hard on having fruit similar to Jesus. I want to give blankets. I want to run a soup kitchen. I want to give money to the poor. And those are all good things. I'm not saying stop doing that. That was the fruit of him living there. But we try to recreate the fruit without first having the root be one who endlessly abides in him in the here and now. And I think if you take anything away from this, just practice being in the now. And if you don't know what that means, ask him. He wants worshipers in truth and spirit, and he is so explicit in saying, those who seek shall find. So seek to live in the now, seek to abide in him, and it's inevitable. The kingdom bears fruit. That's just what it does.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks again for the time. We'll talk to you guys soon.
Thanks.